Have you ever had to wait for something you really wanted? Like, I'm not talking about waiting 15 minutes for dessert, or I'm not talking about waiting overnight for your birthday presents in the morning. I'm talking about, like, have you ever had to wait like a long time? Not like hours, but have you ever had to wait like days or weeks or even months? That can be really difficult, right? To wait that long. Well, in the Big God story today, we'll learn about David. And David, he had to wait for not days or months. He had to wait for years. For 15 years, he had to wait for God's promise to be fulfilled. That's a really long time. 15 years. You see, when David was just a boy, Samuel visited his father's house. His father was Jesse. And Samuel came to anoint the new king of Israel. Jesse brought out all of his sons, and Samuel eventually realized that the son who would become king was David, the youngest. David's brought out and they anoint him as king. They pour oil over him, symbolizing this anointing that he would one day be king. The problem was, it wasn't quite time for David to be king, because there was already a king. His name was Saul. And Saul had disappointed God, and God was preparing for the next king, but it wasn't quite time for David yet. Well, many years later, Saul finally dies. And you would think that now is the time for David to take charge. But it wasn't quite his time. In fact, Saul's son, he thought he should be king. And so he went to be king. And David was probably a little bit confused, probably a little bit unsure, but he chose to trust in God's promise. He knew that God had anointed him to be king. And so he was going to wait and trust in God's timing, because he knew that God is in control. And so David takes his family to Hebron, and there for a second time, the rulers of Judah get together and they anoint him as king. But it's still not quite time for him to take the throne. In fact, Israel would war for 7 more years. The people were unsure and they fought over who should be the king. And finally, after 7 more years, David is anointed for the 3rd time as king. That's a long time to wait. 15 years after his first time of being anointed, David is finally made to be king. And he was king of Israel for like 40 years after that. Sometimes it can be hard to understand God's timing. Can we hard to understand why we're having to wait? But we have to trust that God is in control. The Bible tells us that God is sovereign. That means that he's in control of all things. And we can trust that God's timing is always best for us, because God's in control. He is sovereign.